Subaru didn't just close a factory, they crossed a line that no one thought they would. Production has stopped, American jobs are gone, and a company built on trust just flipped the script. But here's what no one's admitting. This wasn't sudden. It was planned, and the fallout is personal. Your car, your community, your future. Why did Subaru really pull out of the United States? What did the government know before it happened? And can a brand survive after it turns its back on the people who built it? Because by the end of this video, you'll see, it's not just Subaru leaving. It's a warning for every American worker. What's happening? For nearly 4 decades, the Subaru of Indiana automotive plant in Lafayette stood as more than just an assembly line. It was a promise, a symbol, a bridge between a Japanese automaker and American workers who had once been skeptical of anything not stamped made in Detroit. Yet somehow Subaru earned its place, without fanfare or flashy slogans, but with consistency, care, and a quiet respect for the people who kept its wheels turning. When it opened in the late 1980s, the idea of a foreign manufacturer thriving in the American Midwest was seen as bold. Some even said it was naive. But over time, that perception shifted. The Indiana plant became a benchmark. The Outback, the Legacy, the Ascent. Models built not in Tokyo, but on Hoosier soil. Over 6,000 workers clocked in every day. Many of them second or third generation auto workers. They weren't just making cars, they were building trust. One frame, one engine, one shift at a time. Subaru didn't just pay wages, it paid respect. It offered generous benefits, job stability, and most importantly, dignity. Employees were treated as partners, not just line workers, and that reputation extended beyond the gates. Local suppliers built their businesses around the plant. Schools built STEM programs to prepare students for careers there. Real estate markets, diners, small shops, all thrived in the gravitational pull of a factory that felt more like a family. In a time when the word outsourcing haunted entire towns, Subaru stood as the exception. Foreign in origin, but proudly American in operation, which is what made what happened next so unthinkable. And just when you thought it won't get any worse, Subaru's executives announced the shutdown not as betrayal, but as strategy. Why Subaru did it? Subaru's official statement was crisp, corporate, and devastatingly blunt. In light of shifting global logistics, increased regulatory costs, and evolving demand structures, production in the United States is no longer economically sustainable. Behind that tidy language was a colder calculus. The biggest driver was cost. New tariffs on imported hybrid parts, especially from Japan and South Korea, had spiked production overhead by more than 17%. Add to that the rising cost of U.S. labor, inflationary pressure on steel and aluminum, and increasingly complex environmental protection agency, emissions mandates. And Subaru's Indiana plant was becoming an expensive outlier in the company's global strategy. Subaru was also under pressure to transition faster to electric vehicles, but retrofitting the Indiana plant for full EV production would cost nearly $3.6 billion. Executives, backed by Tokyo shareholders, argued that this money would go further in countries with cheaper labor and more lenient emissions targets. Mexico and Thailand were named as potential hubs for electric mobility assembly, with tax breaks and lower compliance thresholds tipped as deciding factors. In other words, this wasn't personal, it was math. Global demand had shifted. The internal combustion engine was being phased out, and Subaru wasn't willing to gamble on retooling a U.S. plant when cheaper, faster options were on the table. They called it optimization. But to thousands of American families, it felt like erasure. And as the spreadsheets were balanced in Tokyo boardrooms, real lives across the American Midwest were unraveling. Real lives, real losses. Marissa and Joe Mitchell both worked at the Indiana plant, one in logistics, the other on final inspection. Between them, they made over $120,000 a year. Their kids went to the local high school. Their mortgage was modest. Their life was stable. Today, both are unemployed. Their severance covers 2 months. Their health insurance expires in 30 days. Down the street, Helen's Diner, opened since the early 1970s, has closed its doors. The owner says foot traffic vanished almost overnight. Across town, the local credit union is seeing a spike in mortgage deferrals. Churches are holding job fairs instead of choir practice. High schoolers are dropping out to take up shifts at local warehouses to help support their families. It is a ripple effect, but the kind that moves fast and hits hard. There's something uniquely cruel about the way this collapse unfolded, because Subaru wasn't a failing company. It was healthy, profitable, and still growing. That made the shutdown feel less like necessity and more like abandonment. Workers weren't laid off because the business collapsed. They were laid off because the business moved. This is what happens when the logic of globalization collides with the fabric of local life. It isn't just about numbers, it's about names. Names of workers who gave decades. Names of kids whose college plans just changed. Names of small business owners whose dream just died. And as the dust settles, one question echoes louder than the rest. Was any of it worth it? If you're shocked by what Subaru just did, share this video. These stories matter, and they're being buried. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment with how this shutdown is affecting your town, your job, or your trust in the auto industry. We bought American. They left anyway. The backlash was instant, and it was personal. Across social media, loyal Subaru owners posted photos of their cars with captions like "betrayed," "sold out," and "so much for made in America." Hashtags like "Ibili we bought American" and "Ridio Subaru sold us out" began trending on platforms like X and Instagram within hours of the shutdown announcement. These were not casual buyers. Many had proudly chosen Subaru over larger automakers, specifically because of the company's American manufacturing presence. They believed in the message, reliability, safety, community. For years, Subaru's plant in Lafayette, Indiana had been a selling point. Sales staff across the country proudly reminded customers that the vehicles were not just assembled in America, they were part of the American workforce. Buyers took pride in knowing their Outback or Legacy supported U.S. jobs. Now that trust was gone, and the emotional whiplash? Devastating. One viral video showed a veteran returning his keys to a dealership, stating, "I served my country. I bought American. Subaru left anyway." The clip racked up over 5 million views in 3 days. It was not the only one. Across Facebook groups and Reddit forums, stories poured in. Families who had driven Subarus for decades said they would never buy again. Community sentiment turned from admiration to accusation. This was not a marketing crisis. It was an identity crisis. Subaru hadn't just shut down a factory. It had shattered the myth that loyalty went both ways. The outrage wasn't about the car, it was about the lie. And that lie would soon start choking the very foundation of Subaru's U.S. presence, its dealerships. Dealerships on life support. Inside Subaru dealerships, the silence was deafening. In cities like Des Moines, Salt Lake, and Springfield, showrooms that once bustled with weekend traffic now sat half empty. The usual buzz of customers browsing, Foresters, and Crosstreks had vanished. The factory shutdown meant fewer vehicles arriving on lots, but that was only the beginning. Service departments, once the financial backbone of these dealerships, began reporting sharp declines in traffic. Without the promise of new models or long-term vehicle support, customers were less likely to return for scheduled maintenance. Technicians were sent home early. Parts inventory began to thin. Some dealers tried to pivot to used cars. Others slashed prices on remaining stock. None of it was working. In states like Indiana, where the factory had been a source of regional pride, local dealers were hit hardest. One franchisee in Lafayette told local media, "We're not just losing cars, we're losing our credibility." Subaru of America attempted to calm the waters with a press release promising new electrified models soon, but dealers were not buying it. They had heard the promises before. The real strain came behind closed doors. Franchisees began calling for emergency meetings. Some explored litigation. Others openly discussed switching brands. For many, the Subaru brand was no longer a selling point. It was a liability. Customers were angry, and salespeople had no answers. Some smaller dealerships, especially those in rural areas, were on the brink of closure. Subaru's reputation had been built on loyalty, trust, and transparency. Now its most loyal allies, its U.S. dealers, were clinging to survival. The company needed a lifeline. What it offered instead was a new corporate excuse, the EV excuse. Subaru's official statement came swiftly. The plant shutdown was part of a strategic realignment toward electrification. At first glance, it sounded like progress. Electric vehicles are the future, after all, but the details, those were missing. Subaru claimed that future models would be more efficient, more sustainable, and globally manufactured. Critics read between the lines. That meant not built in America. Subaru was not moving EV production to Indiana. It was outsourcing it, either back to Japan or, more controversially, to Chinese joint ventures. In other words, the Lafayette closure was not about innovation, it was about cost. And people noticed. The Wall Street Journal called it a bait and switch wrapped in green PR. Former executives anonymously confirmed to Reuters that cost-cutting, not electrification, had driven the decision. For loyal buyers, this was the final insult. Many had supported Subaru because they believed it was a brand with values. Now those values looked like marketing copy. Consumers asked, if electrification was the goal, why not retrofit the Indiana plant? Why not keep American workers employed while building the next generation of vehicles? Even environmental groups criticized the move. The Sierra Club issued a rare rebuke, accusing Subaru of using climate language to mask economic abandonment. It was the kind of accusation that stuck and spread. The EV excuse wasn't just failing to convince, it was fueling a fire. Americans had tolerated offshoring for decades, but doing it in the name of sustainability while laying off thousands? That crossed a line, and it was a line the President of the United States was about to redraw with force. Trump responds, "They will pay." President Donald Trump wasted no time. At a rally in Fort Wayne, Indiana, just 90 minutes from the shuttered Subaru plant, he issued a fiery ultimatum. If Subaru thinks it can abandon American workers and keep selling cars here, they've got another thing coming. We are putting a 100% tariff on every Subaru made outside the United States. No more games, no more offshoring. They will pay. The crowd erupted. For Trump, this was more than a trade issue, it was a betrayal. Subaru had once been one of the few foreign automakers praised for investing in U.S. jobs. Now it was walking away. Trump's threat sent a message to every other automaker. Loyalty to American labor was no longer optional. It was the price of access. The economic shock was immediate. Subaru's stock dropped nearly 7% overnight. Analysts warned that if the tariffs took effect, Subaru's margins in the U.S. would collapse. The company scrambled to respond, but Trump doubled down on X, writing, "No more excuses. We build in America, or we don't sell in America." The White House hinted at broader measures, possibly expanding tariffs to any automaker caught shifting EV production offshore. The political message was clear. The age of polite globalization was over. Economic nationalism was now hard policy. Trump's speech was not just red meat for his base. It reflected growing public rage. Americans were tired of corporations using buzzwords like sustainability and efficiency to justify gutting communities. Trump seized that anger and turned it into leverage. And Subaru, it was caught flat-footed, facing a wave of political, financial, and emotional pressure that showed no signs of slowing down. Because now the debate was no longer about a single factory. It was about the soul of American industry. The chain reaction. Across the Midwest, the closure of Subaru's U.S. production plant was more than just a single factory shutdown. It was a detonation. When the lights went out at Subaru's facility in Lafayette, Indiana, it did not just idle a few thousand assembly line workers. It collapsed a regional supply chain ecosystem that had taken decades to build. The steel rolled in from Gary. The seats were sewn together in Elkhart. The electronic modules came in by truck from suburban Columbus. One shutdown, and all of it stalled. Within days, ripple effects turned into economic shockwaves. Tool and die shops that specialized in Subaru-specific parts began furloughing machinists. Logistics firms that timed deliveries down to the minute suddenly had empty trucks and idle drivers. A seat foam manufacturer in Dayton laid off over 100 workers. A stamping plant in Peoria issued pink slips. The damage spread like a virus, untraceable at first, then everywhere. Subaru's suppliers were particularly vulnerable because the company had cultivated an unusually tight network of regional partners. Unlike other automakers that imported large segments from abroad, Subaru had built a reputation for supporting American-made parts. That ecosystem made them efficient. It also made them fragile. With no orders coming in, companies that had bet everything on Subaru were left with warehouses full of unsellable inventory, and no other buyers lined up. And then there were the towns, communities that had carved out identities around these contracts, suburbs and small cities that treated Subaru business like gospel. In Marion, a subcontractor that made injection-molded trim for Subaru Outbacks laid off half its staff. In Lafayette itself, the knock-on effects hit the service industry. Cafes near the plant closed early. Grocery stores saw declining foot traffic. Local car dealerships were now sitting on idle inventory. No one wanted to test drive. Subaru's exit did not just empty a plant, it drained the oxygen from a region's economy. As the Midwest's industrial arteries began to clot, it became obvious this was not just a business decision. It was a betrayal that reached into families, unions, school systems, and legacies. Because when Subaru left, it didn't just take jobs, it took stability. The UAW mobilizes nationally. Even though Subaru's workforce was not unionized, the United Auto Workers did not stay silent. In fact, it was the silence that made them louder. UAW leadership saw the Subaru exit as a signal flare, a warning that no automaker, no matter how integrated into the American landscape, was above walking away. And if Subaru could vanish overnight, who was next? Within 48 hours of the announcement, the UAW launched a media campaign under the banner number sign, "Stop the Exit." Billboards went up in Detroit, Toledo, and Indianapolis reading, "Next it's Ford, then it's your job." The message was simple. This was not just a Subaru problem. It was a systemic one that could touch any factory, any worker at any moment. The UAW's initial moves were symbolic: press releases, interviews, appearances on cable news. But by the second week, action followed rhetoric. Rolling strikes were announced at key parts suppliers for Honda, Toyota, and Ford. The strategy was precise: target the soft underbelly of the automotive chain, stall the production lines, not at the final assembly, but at the source of spark plugs, harnesses, gaskets. Make the cost of disloyalty visible to every manufacturer watching. In Washington, UAW officials met with sympathetic lawmakers to push for new legislation. They argued for a national industrial protection policy, penalties for corporations that shut down domestic production without at least 18 months warning, tax incentives tied directly to job retention, and perhaps most radically, a proposal for a national labor watch list. Any automaker considering offshoring more than 10% of its operations would trigger an automatic congressional hearing. For the first time in years, the UAW was not just negotiating contracts, it was rewriting the rules of engagement. And this time, the fight was not about wages, it was about permanence. Governors demand answers. In Indiana, the response from state officials was immediate and furious. Within 24 hours of Subaru's announcement, Governor Jennifer Holtz convened an emergency session of the state legislature. She called the closure a gut punch to every worker who believed loyalty went both ways. But it did not end there. By week's end, governors from Michigan and Ohio joined her in a tri-state industrial summit. The agenda? One item only: stopping the bleeding. While the governors represented different parties, the reaction was bipartisan. Republican leaders in Ohio demanded steep, retaliatory tariffs on any Subaru vehicle imported into the United States. They called for a return to the 25% chicken tax era, where vehicles built outside U.S. borders faced punishing duties. Let them sell Foresters in Tokyo, one senator barked during the session. But not in Toledo. Democratic officials in Michigan took a different approach. They proposed emergency subsidies to keep affected supply chain businesses alive, payroll support, tax deferrals, infrastructure investment to help lure in replacement manufacturing. But their message was just as urgent. This cannot become the new normal. If one company is allowed to make this move unchallenged, it opens the door for every automaker looking to please shareholders by hollowing out their American footprint. The governors went public with a joint resolution. Corporate exits of this magnitude should trigger federal review, immediate support for affected workers, and a pause on public contracts with any company that offshores U.S. production. It was more than rhetoric. It was a plea for boundaries in a world where boardrooms acted without warning and with no consequences. For state leaders trying to hold together communities already battered by deindustrialization, Subaru's exit was not just a closure. It was a red line. When Subaru stopped being Subaru. There was a time when Subaru was not just a car brand. It was a cultural badge. It meant family. It meant dogs in the back seat, bikes on the roof rack, and loyalty that spanned generations. You did not just buy a Subaru. You joined a tribe. In Vermont, Colorado, Oregon, and beyond, Subaru was the car of people who cared about nature, about safety, about values. That image is now cracking. With the U.S. shutdown, a new narrative has emerged. Subaru is no different than any other cost-cutting multinational. Outdoor lovers and loyalists took to social media in disbelief. Hashtags like "WeCharSubaru sold out" and "Corporate Trader" began trending. Influencers, once paid to promote the Subaru brand, started deleting posts and issuing quiet apologies. Even longtime fans questioned their next purchase. The brand collapse was not just about economics, it was about betrayal of identity. Subaru's marketing had long leaned on the values of community, environmentalism, and social responsibility. Now those very values were being weaponized by the public. Environmentalists asked why Subaru would increase shipping emissions by moving production overseas. Families who prized safety and local jobs asked how a brand could talk about love. It's what makes a Subaru while laying off thousands. Dealerships in progressive cities reported a wave of canceled orders and angry calls. In Portland, one store manager said the backlash was worse than any recall. People felt like it was their company, he told local news, and now they feel abandoned. This was not just a plant closure. It was a collapsive story. A brand that had always seemed different, quirky, grounded, reliable, now felt like just another runaway corporation. And in that fracture, something deeper was exposed. Subaru did not just lose customers. It lost believers. Workers fight back. It started with silence. Factory gates locked, parking lots empty, production lines cold. But within days, the silence broke. Outside Subaru's shuttered U.S. assembly plant in Lafayette, Indiana, the first pickets appeared. Line workers, machinists, welders. Then came the supervisors, retirees, and even local business owners. These weren't just protests. They were a reckoning. The signs they carried read like battle cries. We built this. Bring Subaru back. And simply betrayed. By the end of the first week, mass picketing had spread to the corporate offices and parts depots. Thousands rallied across Indiana and Ohio. Social media lit up with the hashtag #BringSubaruBack, a campaign that quickly broke into national headlines. Retired union members, some in their 70s, stood shoulder to shoulder with newly laid-off 20-somethings. One viral photo captured a Vietnam veteran in a Subaru uniform holding a sign that read, "50 years of loyalty sold out in a boardroom." This wasn't just a labor dispute anymore. It was something deeper. Workers weren't demanding better pay or even reinstatement. They were demanding recognition, respect. The soul of Subaru's American identity was being called into question, and the workers who helped build it were not going to disappear quietly. For decades, Subaru had sold more than cars. They sold trust. That trust had now been shattered, and the workers were drawing a line. As this wave of public protest grew stronger, the fight moved beyond picket lines. The next battlefront was personal, playing out in garages, driveways, and dealerships. The implications were bigger than politics. They reached into the very heart of American identity. What happens now? Step back. Forget the models. Forget the tariffs. This moment, Subaru shutting down U.S. production, is more than just corporate news. It's a seismic moment in the story of American industry. For decades, Buy American was more than a slogan. It was a belief, a badge of honor for working families, veterans, and small-town communities who saw their labor reflected in the machines they made. Subaru wasn't made in America by accident. The Lafayette plant was proof that globalization and national pride could coexist, that workers in Indiana could help shape a global brand. And now, that idea is under siege. Some argue this is the inevitable cost of competition, that companies must cut and optimize to survive. But others see it differently. They see betrayal. They see a global giant chasing cheaper labor while discarding the very people who built its reputation in the United States. They see a government, so far, willing to talk tough but unable to prevent the exodus. And what happens next will define far more than Subaru's brand. Because behind Subaru are others: Toyota, Nissan, Mazda, Honda, all watching, all calculating. If this gamble works, if customers forget and profits rise, then this is the new playbook. But if it backfires, if the backlash grows louder, if the political consequences escalate, then maybe, just maybe, the tide turns. This isn't about tariffs, it's about trust, about whether American manufacturing still matters, about whether loyalty on both sides of the assembly line still means something. The question isn't just whether Subaru will return. The question is whether this is the beginning of the end of American industry as we knew it, or the painful birth of a more resilient, worker-first future. Because what just happened isn't business as usual. It's history in real time, and you're living in the middle of it. This isn't just about one factory. This is about every American worker wondering if their job is next. About every driver who believed in buying local, only to get blindsided. Sheesh. So what do you think? Did Subaru betray America, or is this just the new cost of staying competitive? We want to hear your story. Leave a comment below, hit that like button if this video opened your eyes, and make sure you subscribe, because we're not done exposing what's really happening in America's auto industry. The next closure could be even closer to home.